I want you to try something with me right now. Close your eyes for just a moment and ask yourself a deceptively simple question. Where do you exist? Not where your body is sitting, not the coordinates of your skin and bones, but where the you that is aware right now is actually located. Where is the witness? Where is the center of experience? Most people answer, without thinking, behind the eyes, inside the skull, somewhere in that dense labyrinth of neurons we call the brain. That is command central. That is headquarters. That is where I live. But consider a possibility that overturns almost everything you have been trained to assume. What if the brain is not the origin of consciousness, but the receiver and exquisite interface translating something larger into sensation, thought, and language? What if awareness is not confined inside the head at all? What if the you identify with has always been distributed, extended field? Like, this is where the conversation becomes more than spiritual poetry. Across decades, a small but persistent body of researchers have tried to measure what is usually dismissed as intangible: the human biofield, the electromagnetic and informational environment associated with living systems. Dr. Valerie Hunt, whose work is often cited in biofield discussions, spent years studying psychophysiology and using electromyography to track electrical activity. In the course of her investigations, she described observations that challenged the standard story, suggesting that measurable energetic patterns around the body can shift in response to stimuli in ways that do not always map neatly onto the timing of conscious thought as people experience it. Even if you hold that cautiously, the implication is still worth sitting with. Because if there is an organizing field that participates in perception and regulation, then the question changes. It is no longer only what am I thinking, it becomes what am I tuning into. Not only what is happening to me, but what is happening through the larger system that I am. And if awareness is field-like, if it is not a prisoner behind the forehead, then who is steering this ship? Is it the chattering mind that narrates your day, or something deeper, a regulatory intelligence that senses, anticipates, and steers beneath language? You can feel this without believing any doctrine. Think of the moments when you walked into a room and knew the emotional climate before anyone spoke. Think of the instant your body tightened before your mind found a reason. Think of the strange certainty that arrives without an argument, an inner yes that feels quiet, spacious, and undeniable. Whatever you call it, intuition, nervous system, intelligence, field, sensitivity, it points to the same lived truth you are guided by more than thought. Now let's connect this to what you have been trying to do all along: healing, transformation, manifestation. The passage from one version of yourself into another. Here's what most people misunderstand about manifestation. They have been taught it is primarily a mental technique. Visualize the outcome. Generate the emotion of already having it. Hold the picture steady. Repeat affirmations. Build the vision board. Wait for reality to comply. And perhaps you have tried. Perhaps you have felt small results, synchronicities, symbolic confirmations, little coincidences that kept you engaged. But the larger shifts, the ones that reconfigure identity and life structure, did not materialize. Then doubt creeps in, and the mind does what it always does. It blames the self. Maybe I am broken. Maybe I am doing it wrong. Maybe everyone else has a code I cannot access. Let me be precise. You are not broken. The issue is not your sincerity, nor your desire, nor your intelligence. The issue is that many popular teachings hand you tools without explaining the architecture underneath the tools. They describe what to practice, but not how the practice interfaces with reality. They prescribe techniques without clarifying the layer of your being where change actually consolidates. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: your physical body is not the foundation of who you are. It is not the densest, most causative layer. It is the output, an expression, a rendering, a visible consequence of patterns held in subtler dimensions of the system. You already know this in ordinary biology. Your body is not static. It is constantly renewing cells, turning over tissues, repairing chemistry, recalibrating neural pathways, strengthening or weakening based on repeated signals. The body is a process, not a thing. A living event, not a fixed object. So the deeper question becomes, what instructions govern that renewal? What is the template according to which your body is perpetually reassembled? This is where field language becomes practical instead of mystical. Whether you frame it as energetic architecture, informational patterns, bioelectromagnetic regulation, or psychophysiological coherence, the central idea is the same. There is a patterning layer that precedes structure. The body does not just happen. It is organized. It is coordinated. It follows a blueprint, dynamic, responsive, and shaped by what you repeatedly inhabit. Think of it like this: your body is the shadow cast on the ground. The field, the patterning intelligence, the organizing template is the object casting the shadow. If you want to change the shadow permanently, you do not fight the shadow. You move the object. You alter the source. Many interventions, whether they are medical, therapeutic, or spiritual, operate primarily at the shadow level. They address what has already printed: symptoms, behaviors, outcomes, circumstances. And these interventions can be helpful. But if you want lasting structural change, you have to work upstream. You have to engage the template before it becomes form. This is why the chrysalis phase you are in feels so strange. You are not merely rearranging external details. You are reorganizing the patterning layer that generates your external details. You are changing the signal at the source, so the rendering must eventually follow. And this is where healing becomes radically redefined. Most people wait until pain forces attention. They wait until a symptom is loud, until a diagnosis is named, until the body is no longer able to compensate. But if patterning precedes structure, then by the time the physical symptom appears, the condition has often been building in subtler ways through chronic tension, prolonged stress chemistry, unprocessed emotion held in the nervous system, repeated relational patterns that keep you in survival mode. This does not mean you caused illness through blameworthy thinking. It means your system has been receiving and transmitting signals for a long time, and those signals shape biology. The nervous system does not only respond to the world, it predicts the world. It prepares the body for what it expects. If it expects threat, it organizes your chemistry accordingly. If it expects rejection, it prepares your muscles, posture, breath, and attention accordingly. If it expects scarcity, it narrows perception and keeps you braced. Over time, bracing becomes a baseline. A baseline becomes a body. This is why you cannot fully heal while bypassing the emotional and relational field. Your body is not separate from your consciousness. It is consciousness in material form. The same intelligence that orchestrates your heartbeat, digestion, and immune response is also listening to your emotional truth. If your mouth says "I'm fine," but your field says "I am terrified," the body will believe the field. Some consciousness researchers, including Dr. William Tiller, attempted to explore how intention and subtle conditions might interface with physical systems. These ideas remain debated, and they should be approached with discernment rather than certainty. But the practical takeaway does not require you to settle every scientific controversy. The practical takeaway is grounded and immediate. What you repeatedly inhabit, emotionally, cognitively, relationally, organizes your system. It shapes what you become able to perceive, tolerate, and create. So if you want to understand why manifestation works sometimes and fails other times, stop focusing only on the mental image. Ask a deeper question: what is my baseline state? What is my nervous system broadcasting? What is my field rehearsing? When I am not trying because the field does not care about your occasional visualization, if your daily baseline is fear, contraction, resentment, or self-rejection. A few minutes of mental technique cannot outvote hours of embodied expectation. The system follows what is repeated, not what is wished. And this is where everything we have discussed, fifth dimensional awareness, timeline navigation, the chrysalis shadow integration, locks into a single coherent mechanism. To shift timelines, you must shift attention. To shift attention, you must regulate the nervous system. To regulate the nervous system, you must stop waging war against your own interior. And to stop waging war, you must integrate the shadow, the stored energy of everything you were taught to reject. The field cannot become coherent while half of you is exiled. So what do you do with this right now in a way that is not merely inspirational but operational? You begin by relocating your sense of self. Instead of living as if you are a head dragging a body through life, you begin to inhabit yourself as a field breath, sensation space, awareness. You learn to feel your boundaries. You learn to sense when you contract, and you learn to soften without collapsing. You learn to tell the difference between fear and truth. In the body, fear compresses and rushes. Truth expands and steadies. You begin to treat your inner atmosphere as sacred, not by becoming paranoid, but by becoming selective. You stop feeding your field with constant threat narratives and draining conversations during transition. You cultivate stillness, not as performance, but as recalibration. You give the system space to reorganize, and you do not wait for perfect to begin. You simply start practicing coherence. One honest breath, one aligned choice, one boundary honored, one truth spoken. Without apology, one shadow aspect acknowledged instead of suppressed. If the mind tries to argue, return to the felt sense. The most revolutionary shift you can make is this: you stop trying to force reality from the surface, and you begin reshaping reality at the template. Because if your consciousness truly lives in a field like intelligence, if you are not confined inside the skull, then you are not merely reacting to the world. You are participating in its construction, not through fantasy, but through frequency, not through control, but through coherence, not through spiritual spectacle, but through embodied alignment. And once you grasp that, you stop asking, why isn't it working? And you start asking the question that actually changes outcomes. What am I broadcasting when I am not trying? That is where healing begins. That is where creation becomes stable. That is where the chrysalis completes its work, not by you forcing the butterfly, but by you becoming coherent enough to let the new form emerge. Skin cells regenerate on a rapid cycle. Red blood cells are replaced within months. Even your bones, dense, heavy, seemingly permanent, are continuously remodeled with major renewal across years. Your body is not a fixed object. It is a living reconstruction project, printing and reprinting itself in real time. So here's a question that unlocks everything. What instructions is it following if the tissues are constantly rebuilding? Where is the template stored? Where is the blueprint that tells this river of matter what shape to take? As it flows within the framework, we have been exploring the answer. Not in the tissue itself. The answer is in the patterning layer, the field. And this is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, because it flips the usual direction of causality. If there is distortion in the blueprint, if a pattern of dysfunction has been encoded at the template level, then each regeneration cycle becomes a kind of loyalty oath. The body, doing what it is designed to do, faithfully reproduces the pattern it has been given. In other words, you can intervene at the physical layer, repeatedly medication, surgery, radiation, supplementation, symptom management, and sometimes you will create relief. Sometimes you will even create remission. But if the organizing pattern remains unchanged, the system can rebuild the same output again, later, because you have been addressing the printout, not the file. This is the logic behind what Dr. William Tiller described as a ratchet effect: information flowing from subtle to dense, from the level of consciousness and pattern into progressively more material layers. In this model, reality is not built from matter upward. Reality is built from pattern downward. A thought becomes a felt state. A felt state becomes a chronic physiological signal. A chronic signal becomes an energetic imprint. An imprint becomes structure. And what makes a ratchet is the way it locks. Once a pattern clicks into each layer, it holds its position. It becomes more stable, more habitual, more real as it descends. So by the time you consciously recognize a symptom, by the time you can name it and point to it, the pattern is rarely confined to the body alone. It is often woven through emotion, attention, identity, expectation, and the subtle reflexes of your nervous system. This is not a statement of blame. It is a statement of mechanics. Now here is the reversal that restores power. If disease can travel from subtle to dense, healing can travel the same pathway. But this is the part conventional models often ignore. Attempting to heal from the densest layer upward can be slow and inconsistent. You are trying to reverse the ratchet from the bottom. You are pushing against the direction the cascade has already taken. Lasting transformation in this architecture occurs when the pattern is changed at the level where it first organized itself, the level of thought, meaning, and consciousness. That does not mean ignoring medicine or the physical body. It means recognizing that the most durable forms of healing involve upstream change that then naturally propagates downstream. Dr. Richard Gerber, in his exploration of vibrational medicine, described layered strata of the human energetic system: an etheric layer close to the body, an emotional or astral layer, and a mental layer that shapes the others. Whether you use his language or prefer a more contemporary framing, cognition, affect, autonomic regulation, bioelectric signaling, the core principle remains. Mental patterns shape emotional patterns. Emotional patterns shape the energetic and physiological regulation. Regulation shapes biology. And if you accept that even as a working hypothesis, then a sentence that sounds provocative becomes deeply practical. Healing at the level of thought can create more durable effects than healing at the level of symptom alone. Not because thought is magic, but because thought is upstream patterning. When the upstream pattern changes, the system receives new instructions. This is also why visualization sometimes works and sometimes fails. When it works, it is not because you briefly imagined a better life and the universe decided to reward you. It works because consciously or unconsciously you touched the blueprint. You generated a coherent pattern at the mental level that had enough stability, repetition, and emotional alignment to begin overwriting the existing template. When it fails, it is not because you are defective. It fails because the signal was faint, scattered, or contradicted by a stronger baseline pattern already installed. A few minutes of mental imagery cannot consistently override a lifetime of embodied expectation. If your nervous system is broadcasting threat, scarcity, or unworthiness as its default, then your conscious visualization is trying to speak over a loudspeaker that is already blaring in the background. So the real question becomes, how do you generate enough coherent power at the mental level to overwrite the blueprint? This is where we move from inspirational language into a step-by-step mechanism. First, you need to understand that thoughts are not weightless. They are not merely private concepts floating in a sealed skull. A thought has structure. It carries an implicit instruction. It has a frequency signature, a pattern that shapes attention, physiology, and perception. When you think a thought with emotional charge, you are not only having an experience, you are imprinting architecture into the mental layer of your system. And then the cascade begins. That mental pattern influences the emotional layer. The emotional layer is not merely feeling. It is a chemical and electrical climate that changes heart rate, variability, breathing patterns, muscle tone, hormonal release, immune signaling. If the thought is repeated, if it becomes a story, a belief, an identity, then the emotional layer begins to organize around it consistently. The nervous system starts predicting life through that lens. Next, that emotional climate shapes the etheric or regulatory scaffold, the subtle orchestration of energy, bioelectric activity, and autonomic tone that sits just beneath visible biology. Finally, That regulatory scaffold shapes the physical expression, inflammation, thresholds, digestion, sleep, pain, sensitivity, tissue repair, posture, even behavioral choices that keep reinforcing the same outcome. Thought, emotion, regulation, matter. This is why chronic conditions can be so persistent when treated only physically. The symptom is not the whole system. It is one end of a multi-layered chain. Here is an image that makes it undeniable. If you find a typo in a printed book and you correct it manually on one page, you may improve that page. But if the source file, the document that generates the print, still contains the typo, then every new print reproduces it. The only permanent fix is to correct the source. In this framework, the source file is not only an abstract belief, it is the repeated pattern of attention, emotion, expectation, and identity that keeps telling the system what to build. And here is the nuance. Most people miss not every thought carries equal creative force. A passing thought, a half-hearted affirmation, a visualization performed like a chore. These are weak signals. They flicker, they scatter, and the baseline pattern remains dominant. What carries power are thoughts that are repeated because repetition is how systems learn. Emotionally coherent because emotion supplies voltage. Somatically embodied because the body must believe it. Held with focused attention because attention stabilizes pattern. This is why crisis states can imprint so deeply. When fear grips you, when grief overwhelms you, when pain consumes you, your thoughts become potent, not because suffering is spiritual, but because the emotional charge is massive. The system marks those moments as important, and what is important gets encoded. This is also why healing requires more than intellectual insight. You can understand a new truth and still live in the old pattern because the body is loyal to what it has practiced. The nervous system does not update because you heard a concept. It updates when it experiences safety, repetition, and coherent new instruction. So what does healing at the mental level look like in practice? It begins with recognizing the difference between surface thoughts and root instructions. Surface thoughts are the daily chatter, worries, plans, judgments. Root instructions are the deeper assumptions that generate the chatter. I am not safe. I am alone. I will be abandoned. Nothing works out. I have to earn love. These are not merely sentences, they are operating commands. To rewrite the blueprint, you do not simply plaster a positive statement over an old command. You locate the command, bring it into awareness, and then install a new instruction with enough coherence that the system starts following it. That installation requires 3 elements. 1. Clarity, knowing the old command you are running. 2. Coherence, aligning thought, emotion, and body into the same message. 3. Consistency, repeating the new instruction until it becomes baseline. This is where most seekers lose the thread. They try to jump straight to element 3, repetition, without doing 1 and 2. They affirm abundance while their body is braced in scarcity. They visualize health while their nervous system is still broadcasting danger. They attempt to think their way out of a pattern that is actually embodied. And that is why it feels like nothing changes. But when you work at the blueprint level, when you bring the body into agreement with the mind, then the cascade becomes your ally. A mental shift naturally restructures the emotional climate. A new emotional climate changes regulation. Regulation changes biology. You stop pushing upward against the current, and you start allowing change to flow downward with the grain of how pattern becomes form. This is not a promise that you will never need physical intervention. It is not a denial of medicine. It is an invitation to reclaim the upstream lever you were never taught. You had the capacity to participate consciously in the template that your body has been faithfully printing. And now we arrive at the next threshold. If coherent thought is the rewrite mechanism, then the next question is inevitable. How do you create coherence on demand? How do you generate a signal strong enough to override an old program without forcing, without faking, without exhausting yourself? That is where we are heading next. Because once you understand how coherence is built, how a thought becomes an instruction, how an instruction becomes a baseline, how a baseline becomes a body, you will never relate to healing or manifestation the same way again. That is why trauma leaves such enduring imprints in a person's inner architecture. It is not only that something painful occurred, it is that in the moment it occurred, your entire system was thrust into an unusually amplified state of arousal. Attention narrows. The nervous system surges. The body floods with survival chemistry. And in that heightened state, whatever meaning your mind assigns, whatever sentence forms silently in the background, can be stamped into you with extraordinary force. This is how a single experience becomes more than an event. It becomes a template. In traumatic moments, the psyche does what it has always done to keep you alive. It searches for an explanation that will help it predict the future. I am not safe. I cannot trust. It will happen again. It was my fault. These are not merely thoughts floating through the mind like passing clouds. In a high-intensity, emotional state, they are encoded as instructions. They become patterns of expectation, patterns of perception, patterns of physiology. They begin shaping what your body anticipates, what your attention selects, what your relationships tolerate, and what your imagination rehearses. And once a pattern becomes stable, it does what stable patterns do, it cascades. The mind influences the emotional climate. The emotional climate influences regulation, breathing, muscle tone, heart rhythm, sleep, digestion. Regulation influences biology. Over time, the original event may be over, but the pattern it generated continues to reproduce itself, not because you are weak, not because you are broken, but because the system is consistent. It is faithful. It builds what it has been told to build. Now here's the mirror image that restores agency. If negatively charged, repeatedly reinforced patterns can shape physiology, then positively coherent patterns can also reshape it, not as a denial of medical reality and never as a substitute for appropriate care, but as an additional lever in the system, an upstream influence that can change how the body interprets threat, how it allocates repair, how it organizes energy, and how it returns to balance. In other words, the same mechanism by which distress imprints can become the mechanism through which repair is supported. And it extends beyond healing. It extends into creation. Because what quantum language points toward at minimum as a powerful metaphor and at maximum as a serious philosophical challenge to materialist assumptions is that reality is not experienced as a neutral film playing in front of you. Reality is experienced as an interactive field in which your attention participates. The observer and the observed are not as cleanly separated as common sense assumes. The act of focusing consciousness changes what becomes salient, what becomes probable, what becomes chosen, and most importantly, what becomes repeated until it hardens into normal. Your consciousness is not simply a spectator watching life unfold. It is a shaping force, not always in the dramatic Hollywood sense of instant miracles, but in the quieter, deeper sense that your attention continually selects, stabilizes, and reinforces the patterns that eventually feel like your world. And if the mind is not merely trapped behind the eyes, if it is distributed through an electromagnetic and informational field that surrounds and permeates the body, then the implications become even more provocative. You are not only thinking inside a head, you are broadcasting from a system. Every thought you generate, every emotion you sustain, every internal image you revisit is not sealed off in private. It is organizing your internal environment, and your internal environment is shaping the choices you make, the signals you send, the opportunities you notice, the people you feel drawn to, and the futures you unconsciously permission into view. This is why focus matters more than most people realize. Your field, whether you interpret that as an energetic structure, a neurobiological pattern, or a psychosocial signal, does not neatly differentiate between what you desire and what you dread. It responds to what you repeatedly energize. It responds to the patterns you feed with time, emotion, and conviction. It responds to the story you rehearse most often, not the story you claim to prefer, for 5 minutes each morning. If you spend a few minutes imagining health but hours researching worst-case scenarios, scanning your body for danger, reliving old fear, and speaking catastrophic conclusions into your day, the system receives a clear instruction. The worry pattern has more repetition. The worry pattern has more emotional voltage. The worry pattern becomes the dominant broadcast. And then people feel betrayed by life, when in truth, life has been reflecting the strongest signal. This is not an accusation. It is a diagnosis of pattern. Look at the internal dialogue you run in an ordinary day. How much of it is oriented toward possibility versus protection? How much of it is oriented toward gratitude versus scanning for what might go wrong? How much of it is genuinely generative, opening space, widening perspective, strengthening coherence, and how much of it is defensive rehearsal training? The body to expect impact your system is always listening. It is always recording. It is always building toward the most rehearsed future. Now we enter territory that can feel radical because it demands that you reconsider where you actually reside. At the beginning, I asked you to imagine consciousness not as a small pilot sealed inside the skull, but as something broader, something field-like. Research often cited in this conversation includes the work of Valerie Hunt, who used electromyography while investigating subtle energetic correlates around the body. Reports from that line of inquiry have been interpreted to suggest that physiological field measurements can shift in response to stimuli in ways that appear to precede the person's conscious awareness. Whether you treat that as definitive science or as provocative anomaly, the philosophical question it raises is the same: what if the brain is not the origin of mind, but an interface within a larger system? If the brain is an interface, then the you identify with the inner narrator, the conscious decider, may not be the first mover you assume it is. This possibility is echoed in a different register by classic findings from decision-making research, most famously Benjamin Libet's experiments. Libet observed what is often called a readiness potential, measurable preparatory activity in the brain that can occur before a person reports conscious awareness of the intention to act. The details of interpretation are debated, but the central disruption remains: the system begins moving before the conscious story catches up. Something initiates, something prepares, and then consciousness arrives a fraction of a second later and says, "I decided." Even if you strip away every mystical implication, this alone has profound consequences for transformation. It suggests that willpower, conscious, effortful, white-knuckled control, is not the deepest lever. The deepest lever is the layer that initiates before conscious narration. The deepest lever is the patterning intelligence that lives beneath your declared intentions, your automatic expectations, your embodied beliefs, your emotional set point, your default relationship with safety. In other words, the part of you that generates your life is not primarily the part of you that talks about your life. And this is precisely why so many people exhaust themselves trying to change. They keep attacking the surface. They keep negotiating with the conscious mind. They keep attempting to discipline thoughts one by one, as if transformation is a matter of winning 1,000 tiny debates in the head. But if the deeper strata are driving, if the system is already initiating before you decide, then the path is not mere effort. The path is coherence. The path is reprogramming. The path is changing the baseline signal so thoroughly that the system initiates differently before you even need to fight with yourself. This is where the role of heightened emotional states becomes crucial. When you are in crisis, your thoughts imprint more strongly because emotion supplies voltage. When you are in ecstatic joy, awe, or deep meditative absorption, the same amplification can occur, but in a different direction. Emotion is not simply decoration. Emotion is the power source that tells the system, "This matters. Record this. Build from this." That is why moments of intense fear can produce long-lasting imprints. And it is also why moments of profound coherent safety in the body, clarity in the mind, openness in the heart can become turning points that reorganize your reality. Not because the universe is handing out prizes, but because your system finally broadcasts a signal strong enough to override the old program. This reframes the entire project of manifestation and healing. It is not about forcing yourself to think positive thoughts all day. That approach is brittle and often self-violent. It is not about denying pain, bypassing grief, or pretending you are not afraid. Those strategies simply push charge into the shadow and keep the system split. It is about learning to work with charge consciously. It is about noticing what you repeatedly energize and asking with honesty whether it is building the life you claim to want. It is about reducing the emotional fuel you feed to catastrophic loops. It is about metabolizing fear rather than worshiping it. It is about reclaiming the imaginative faculty, the inner cinema that rehearses futures, and using it deliberately instead of allowing it to run worst-case scenarios by default. Because you are always manifesting something. The only question is whether you are manifesting by design or by habit. And here's the most liberating implication of the field-based model: your conscious mind does not have to micromanage every outcome. You do not have to become a neurotic supervisor of every thought. You need something far more elegant, a new baseline pattern. One that the deeper intelligence begins initiating automatically. That baseline is built the same way any baseline is built: repetition, embodiment, and coherence. When you repeatedly return the body to safety, you change the signal. When you repeatedly practice attention that widens rather than contracts, you change the signal. When you repeatedly choose meanings that empower rather than imprison, you change the signal. When you repeatedly place emotional charge behind a new template, health, connection, creative expansion, you begin to overwrite the old instruction set. Then the ratchet begins moving in the direction you prefer, from thought to feeling, from feeling to regulation, from regulation to form. And that is why this conversation is not merely philosophical. It is architectural. It is about source code. If mind is field, like if the deeper strata initiate your life before the conscious narrator claims credit, then the work is not to bully yourself into perfect thinking. The work is to train the field through coherent states, honest integration, and disciplined attention until the system itself begins selecting higher outcomes without struggle. This is how healing becomes more than symptom management. This is how manifestation becomes more than wishful visualization. This is how you stop fighting your reality and start shaping it from the level where reality is actually organized. And once you understand that the next step becomes obvious, you must learn how to generate coherent states, intentionally, not only in rare moments of crisis or ecstasy, but on demand, in ordinary life, so your field is no longer a recording device for fear, but a stabilizing template for what you are, ready to live. It is not luck. It is not magic. It is the field responding to the most coherent pattern you are broadcasting, responding the way any responsive system responds, when a signal becomes stable enough to entrain what surrounds it. You are not merely discovering a pre-existing reality like a tourist wandering through a fixed landscape. You are participating in reality's ongoing construction moment by moment through the quality of your attention, the emotional charge behind your focus, and the imagery you repeatedly stabilize in the inner space where experience is authored. And this brings us full circle to the holographic model, not as a decorative idea, but as an organizing principle that changes how you interpret your life. If the universe itself did not begin as solid matter, but as a subtler informational order, an initial field, a pattern, a coherent instruction, then what we call matter is the downstream condensation of something more primary. In this view, the material world is not the origin. It is the output. It is the rendered image, the visible interface of an invisible architecture. Tiller's language gestures toward this when he frames reality as descending through layers from subtle informational domains into progressively denser expression until it becomes what we can touch. Whether you treat this as literal physics, metaphysics, or an interpretive bridge, the structural implication remains: pattern precedes form. Instruction precedes manifestation. Blueprint precedes body. And if that is how the macrocosm unfolds, then you, the microcosm, are doing the same thing with every thought, every emotion, every sustained focus of awareness. You generate a pattern at the mental level. That pattern influences the emotional dimension. Emotional tone shapes the energetic organization of your system, your physiology of safety or threat, coherence or fragmentation. And over time, the energetic organization expresses as behavior, relationship, health, and the tangible circumstances that become your life. You are quite literally a universe in miniature, a fractal of the same creative process that birthed stars and galaxies. As above, so below. As within, so without. When this moves from concept to lived recognition, when it becomes something your body understands, not only your intellect, the question stops being what is reality and becomes something far more intimate and far more powerful. What reality am I creating now? We take one step deeper into a territory that is both sobering and profoundly hopeful. If you are a holographic fragment of a universal creative process, you are not only shaping your personal reality, you are participating in the collective field. Every thought you think, every emotion you sustain, every pattern you normalize does not remain sealed inside a private interior. It ripples outward into the wider atmosphere of human consciousness, in which we are all immersed like drops of dye in a shared ocean. Not because you are responsible for the world in some burdensome moral sense, but because fields are by nature relational systems. They do not stop at the boundary of skin. They overlap. They influence. They entrain. This helps explain why collective shifts can happen with a speed that feels almost impossible. Why social movements reach critical mass. Why cultural narratives change seemingly overnight. Why entire generations suddenly speak a new language of identity and meaning. It is not only that individual minds are changing in isolation. It is that the shared field itself is reaching a new threshold of coherence. When enough people stabilize a similar pattern through attention, emotion, repetition, and conviction, the collective weather changes. Reality reorganizes at the macro level because the dominant pattern in the field reorganizes. You are never creating alone. You are always co-creating within a web. And the more coherent your individual field becomes, the more powerfully it influences the field around you. This is the real mechanism behind what people call raising your vibration or holding space. It is not metaphorical. It is not merely poetic. It is the stabilization of a coherent pattern in your system that other systems can entrain to, like tuning forks, resonating into a shared tone. Now let us make this practical, because understanding is only valuable if it becomes usable. If your mind exists in the field, if mental patterns cascade downward to shape emotion, energy, physiology, and tangible behavior, then mental imagery is not a casual daydream. It is a technology. It is a programming language. It is a tool that can write instructions into the holographic template from which your life is continuously reconstructed. And here's the uncomfortable truth: people have been using this technology for as long as humans have existed. Most have simply used it unconsciously, and they have often been coding precisely what they do not want. They imagine disease. They rehearse failure. They replay humiliation in high definition. They run worst-case scenarios like a devotional practice over and over with sincere emotional charge. They revisit trauma not only as a memory but as a living present tense. And each time the inner film plays with strong feeling, the pattern is reinforced at the blueprint level. It is not simply remembered. It is reissued as instruction. Build this again. Prepare for this again. Expect this again. And the body, being exquisitely loyal to the information it receives, obeys. It does not morally judge your imagery. It does not interpret whether a thought is healthy or unhealthy. It does what biological systems do: it adapts to what it repeatedly experiences as true. In Tiller's framing, individuals who continually held vivid imagery of illness, who repeatedly visualized tumors, deterioration, pain, could be understood as stabilizing that pattern in the field. Whether or not you accept every claim in that literature, the underlying psychological reality is undeniable. What you repeatedly imagine with emotional charge becomes the template your nervous system prepares for. And what your nervous system prepares for shapes how your biology allocates resources toward repair or toward defense. That is the ratchet effect in action. Repeated charged imagery becomes a pattern. The pattern becomes a baseline. The baseline becomes a life. But here's the reversal that restores hope without fantasy. The same mechanism that can construct disease can also support healing. If you can unconsciously imprint illness through repeated catastrophic imagery, you can consciously imprint wholeness through coherent imagery of health, vivid, embodied, emotionally true, repeated with patience rather than desperation. You generate a new pattern at the mental level. You reinforce it with feeling, not frantic intensity, but steady conviction. And over time, that pattern begins to cascade downward through the layers. Mental reshapes emotional. Emotional reshapes energetic. Energetic reshapes physical. You are not fighting the system. You are working with its architecture. This is why visualization works for some people and fails for others. It is not that the tool is imaginary. It is that most people apply it too faintly, too inconsistently, and without sufficient coherence to override the entrenched pattern that has been reinforced for years. They visualize for 5 minutes and then worry for 5 hours. They hold a desired image occasionally and a feared image compulsively. They practice hope as a hobby and practice fear as a full-time job. And then they conclude, it doesn't work. But the field was responding the entire time. It responded to the most energized pattern. It responded to the most repeated pattern. It responded to the most believed pattern. So this is what it means for you practically immediately. If you want to heal, if you want to manifest, if you want to consciously sculpt your experience, you must work at the field level. You must become aware of the imagery you habitually hold, the thoughts you loop automatically, the emotions you keep feeding, the meaning you assign to events without questioning. All of it is data. All of it is instruction. All of it is streaming into the blueprint. And the blueprint is always listening. Now you offered a dramatic historical example, stigmata cases in which individuals in sustained states of devotional contemplation reportedly developed wounds resembling crucifixion marks. Whatever one believes about the ultimate cause of such reports, psychophysiological processes, rare medical phenomena, or something beyond current explanation, the example serves a clear principle. Sustained emotionally immersive imagery can exert powerful influence on the body. The boundary between mind and matter is not as rigid as we pretend. The mind is not an abstract ghost floating above biology. It is woven into the body's regulation and expression, which means you have been using creative power your entire life. The difference now is that you are becoming conscious of it. That is the pivot. That is the threshold. Your thoughts are not trivial. They are signals. Your emotions are not merely reactions. They are power supplies. Your inner images are not entertainment. They are blueprints, and the field is always responding, not by judging you, not by punishing you, but by reflecting the pattern you hold most consistently. So the question is not whether you are creating your reality. You are. The question is whether you are creating consciously or unconsciously, by deliberate design or by inherited default. And here is the truth that can sting at first but liberates once you understand it. If you have been stuck, if your body has been struggling, if your life has felt like it is repeating the same limitation in different clothing, it is not necessarily because the universe is withholding from you. It is often because the deeper pattern, the unconscious template, does not yet match what your surface mind says it wants. Until those layers align, the output will keep reflecting the older code. But once you understand the mechanism, you have leverage. You have a map. You know where to work. You stop pleading with the surface. You begin reprogramming the source. You shift the pattern at the mental level, then allow the change to cascade downward through emotion, energy, behavior, and form. And now I want you to pause, because this is not content to be consumed. This is an invitation to participate. Take a breath and ask yourself with ruthless honesty and real gentleness, what inner movie have I been playing on repeat? What is the image I keep returning to when I'm afraid, when I am tired, when I am alone? That image, whatever it is, has been writing your blueprint. The moment you can see it clearly is the moment you can begin to choose differently. Not by force, by coherence, by design. This is active participation, not the passive consumption of an idea, but the deliberate use of your awareness as an instrument. If you have followed the thread this far, you are already standing in the doorway between two ways of living: one where reality happens to you, and one where reality responds to you. Not to your wishes, but to your most stable pattern. So do this with me now in real time. Bring to mind one pattern in your life that you know needs to change. Do not search for the perfect example. Let the most honest one rise. It might be a health condition you have normalized. It might be a relationship dynamic you keep repeating with different faces. It might be a financial ceiling that follows you like a shadow. It might be the quiet fatigue of feeling that you are always almost there but never fully arriving. Let one pattern surface. Hold it gently without drama. Now, ask yourself a question that most people never ask with enough precision to hear the answer. What mental imagery have I been unconsciously holding around this pattern? Not what you claim to believe in public. Not what you affirm when you are trying to be optimistic. What do you picture automatically, reflexively, when you think about this area of your life? What do you see in your inner theater? When no one is watching, what are the recurring scenes? Then go one level deeper. What thoughts do you habitually think about it? What sentences do you repeat in your mind? This always happens. It never works out. I can't trust people. My body is fragile. Money disappears. I always end up alone. You may not say them aloud, but your field has heard them thousands of times. And what emotions do you regularly feel in this area beneath the surface? Not the polished emotion you present, but the true undercurrent: dread, tightness, resentment, shame, numbness, impatience, resignation. This is your internal movie. This is the pattern you have been encoding into your field. And if the architecture we have explored is accurate, if your reality follows the blueprint you stabilize, then it makes sense with painful clarity why the external keeps repeating. Reality has not been betraying you. It has been reflecting you. Now here is the shift. Ask yourself, what would the opposite pattern look like? Not merely the absence of the problem, but the presence of the solution. Because your system does not reorganize around emptiness. It reorganizes around a new instruction. If the pattern is illness, the opposite is not no symptoms. The opposite is vitality, ease of movement, calm, trust in the body, a felt sense of internal cooperation. If the pattern is relational instability, the opposite is not no conflict. The opposite is secure connection, clarity, reciprocity, steady affection, boundaries, honored without punishment. If the pattern is financial limitation, the opposite is not broke. The opposite is resourcing, competence, overflow, stewardship, decisions made from sufficiency rather than panic. So now become specific. If this pattern were already transformed, what would you be thinking? What would your inner dialogue sound like? Not exaggerated, not theatrical, credible. What would you be saying to yourself in the morning? What would be the assumptions under your day? What would you be feeling again? Not euphoric fantasy, but embodied emotional reality. Relief, confidence, safety, spaciousness, quiet satisfaction, a steady sense of being supported. And what imagery would you be holding? What scenes would naturally play in your mind if the new reality were your baseline? See the new day as if it is already normal. Feel the ordinary moments of the transformed life, because the subconscious does not commit to what feels like a miracle. It commits to what feels like home. Now comes the most important element: generate the emotional frequency of it already being real. Not, I hope. Not, I wish. Not, wouldn't it be nice? Those are the signatures of separation. Instead, the calm certainty of ownership, the settled inner posture of someone who is no longer negotiating with reality, because reality has already reorganized. This is the new pattern, and here's the law. If you can hold this new pattern with more consistency, more coherence, and more emotional authority, then the old pattern, the field will respond. The blueprint will shift. Reality will reorganize accordingly. Not instantly, not always dramatically, but reliably, because you are not begging the universe. You're changing the instruction set. If you want to make this participatory rather than theoretical, choose one word that represents the new pattern you are encoding now. One word, not a paragraph. A word is a frequency capsule, a concise instruction to the nervous system, a stabilizing tone. Let it be something like wholeness, trust, steadiness, overflow, clarity, reciprocity, peace, strength, ease. The word itself is less important than the coherence behind it. Now you are ready for the final piece. That pulls every thread into a single coherent tapestry. We have said the mind is not confined to the brain. Consciousness appears to operate through a field. Patterns held in that field can cascade into lived experience. But what does that mean for your position in the larger cosmic structure? Are you a separate individual with a private field floating alone in a dead mechanical universe? Or are you an individuated expression of a larger intelligence, one node, in an interconnected network of awareness? This is where Tiller's proposal becomes disruptive in the most liberating way. If the universe itself did not originate as matter first, but as pattern first, if it emerged from a subtle informational order, a field of potential shaped into form, then matter is not the primary reality. Matter is the crystallized edge of something deeper. In that architecture, the universe is the ultimate cascade, the invisible becoming visible. Pure potential becoming structure. Information becoming form. The ratchet effect on a cosmic scale. And if that is the macrocosm, then you are not separate from it. You are a microcosmic enactment of the same creative process. Your consciousness exists in a field. That field holds patterns. Those patterns crystallize into experience, not as poetry, as architecture. Once you truly recognize that you are not outside the creative process, but an expression of it, your identity shifts. You stop relating to life as a victim of circumstance and start relating to life as a participant in formation. Not in the naive sense that you can control everything, but in the mature sense that you have agency where it matters most, at the level of pattern. You are not powerless. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are a conscious, co-creative agent, working in partnership with the field that is already creating everything. And yes, this requires sobriety. It does not mean you can snap your fingers and override the inertia of years in a single afternoon. Layers exist. The ratchet effect exists. A template reinforced for decades does not dissolve because you had one inspiring meditation. But you can begin. And begin is not small. Beginning is the act that breaks the spell of unconscious default. You can become conscious. You can stop attempting to manipulate the shadow, the surface symptoms, and start repositioning the source. You can stop trying to force outcomes through frantic effort and start working with the field through coherence. Over time, with consistency, emotional alignment, and genuine understanding, you reprogram the blueprint. So contemplate this with precision. Where in your life have you been working at the wrong layer? Where have you been trying to fix the output without rewriting the instruction? Where have you been negotiating with symptoms instead of transforming the pattern that produces them? Consider your health, your relationships, your finances, your identity, your sense of belonging. What imagery are you habitually reinforcing? What emotions are you feeding? What assumptions are running beneath your choices like invisible code? Because those patterns are not private. They are active. They are constructing your reality now and in every moment that follows. Different outcomes require a different pattern, and that pattern begins in the mental dimension at the level of the field where the true leverage point exists. If something in this lands as recognition, rather than information, if you feel that subtle yes in your body, do not let it pass as another temporary insight. Reinforce it. Return to this tomorrow morning and practice again, not as performance, but as stewardship. Share it with someone who is ready not to convince them, but to strengthen the coherence in your own field, because transmission stabilizes what you embody. And if you want an embodied declaration to interrupt the old loop, hold this sentence as a frequency, not a slogan. I am the field becoming aware of itself. Say it internally with steadiness. Let it settle into your nervous system like a new operating system, installing not with fireworks but with quiet authority. Because once you understand this, the path ahead becomes clear. You do not chase reality. You tune reality by changing the pattern you are.